Welcome to Securing America with me, Frank Gaffney, a program that's a kind of owner's manual for protecting the country we love against all enemies, foreign and domestic, to God's glory and that of his kingdom. China, of course, looms large whenever we're having a conversation about the challenges we face that our country must be protected against. The thing that makes China so urgent and important, of course, is that it has actually been engaged in warfare against us now for decades, albeit not of the kinetic kind, but of the so called unrestricted warfare sort. The danger is that it seems China is increasingly both prepared and willing to engage in military operations against the United States, or certainly against its interests and allies in the region, and possibly us as well. And to help us think through what the prospects of that are, what we should be doing to stave it off, and the consequences if we don't, is one of our duty experts on the subject. His name is Colonel Grant Newsham, United States Marine Corps retired. He is a senior fellow of our Center for Security Policy. He is a former Foreign Service officer as well as a United States Marine, and indeed a successful businessman out in the Far East who knows his way around the Western Pacific and is always an extraordinary resource for our thinking about developments in the region and what we should be making of them. Grant Newsham, welcome back to Securing America, sir.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here.
I'd like to start with this event that took place last week, an emergency meeting, we were told, on the margins of the so called Shangri La dialogue in Singapore. And the U.S. Defense Minister Lloyd Austin met with his Chinese counterpart, General Wei Feng, and was rather, I guess, badly beaten up by General Wei, as had been his counterparts, the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor, in previous conversations with their interlocutors. Am I reading that outcome correctly as you see it? And if so, where does that leave us?
Well, I think that General Austin didn't get beaten up quite as badly as Secretary Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan did in Anchorage. But it's just a question of degree. Admiral General Austin, Secretary of Defense Austin, he made his pitch, and the Chinese heard it, but they didn't care. The Chinese had apparently requested this meeting, and it was not to have a discussion. It was so the Americans could hear the Chinese position, which is if you don't lay off Taiwan, we are going to kill you. Later, I believe the Chinese Minister of Defense actually said, smash you to smithereens. So it wasn't a two-way discussion where both sides agreed that let's work this out. It was more calling the Americans in and getting them to put on face masks, while the Chinese, of course, had face masks as well. And then telling the Americans, this is what we think, this is what we are going to do, and you had better not do this. And the Americans gave their talking points, and they didn't back down, but they just gave their American position. And there's a dynamic to these things, and I wasn't in the room, of course, and that does make a difference. But it just depends on who's there and how seriously you're going to be taken. If it had been, say, Mike Pompeo in the room, or Admiral Robert Willard, who used to be at the commander at Indo-PACOM, uh, it would have been a very different dynamic, and the other side could tell. And you can smell weakness. You can when the other side is weak, not necessarily the people, but they're just not frightening you. And I think that is what we saw happen. The Chinese made it clear that they're not going to change their position. But there's an American conceit in all of this, and that is, well, if we're just talking, we can work it out. We like to think that everybody is just a friend we haven't made yet, to paraphrase Will Rogers. And so you took a look at the readouts, what each side said about the meetings, and the Americans constructive, professional, etc. But no, it was the Americans getting in there to hear what the Chinese had to say, and it didn't matter what the Americans said at that point. But there's a yeah.
Let me ask you about the context, and I take the point that Secretary of State Blinken and the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan may have been even more supine than were the Americans led by Lloyd Austin. But I assume that the backdrop for this conversation was the Tony Blinken speech made, I think, at the end of last month, in which he emphasized this idea that we're viewing the Chinese as competitors, yes, but also candidates for our cooperation. And it does sound as though the emphasis was very much on the idea of friendship and a willful blindness towards, um, well, not only the sorts of threats that General Wei laid down, but the behavior that we've seen out of the Chinese of late. And I'd like you to characterize that. You're a trained military officer, you're astute about these things. Am I missing something, or are the Chinese now making basically every effort they can to demonstrate their not only violent capacities, but their intent to use them?
That's right. I think they're definitely testing. And what they have done in recent times is alarming. It actually could have resulted in dead, at least dead Australians, maybe dead Canadians. And what I'm talking about is when a Chinese fighter jet actually shot flares in front of an Australian surveillance plane over the South China Sea, and similarly harassed a Canadian plane that was enforcing North Korean sanctions that China has actually agreed to comply with. If the flare had been ingested into or the flare canister had been ingested into the Australian aircraft jet engine intakes, the plane could have gone down, and we could be talking now about a dead Australian air crew killed by uh, Chinese behavior. And these things don't happen unless it's from the very top. And that is something to really be concerned about. Another thing that didn't get the attention it deserved is just the other day the Chinese said that the Taiwan Strait is not international waters, but it's Chinese. And that's a change from what they even said a couple of years ago. But this too is a test, telling the Americans to see what the Americans do. Do the Americans back down? Do they stay out of the Taiwan Strait? Do they make some sort of half-hearted statements of concern, or what do we do? But they're testing, and it's all with an intention to moving forward. And Taiwan is obviously the immediate target, but particularly the harassment of the aircraft, this is different, and just taken together.
Yeah, we've of course seen this movie before. In I think it was the early days of the George W. Bush administration, when a similar episode, presumably again, as you say, Grant Newsham, um, ordered from the highest levels of the People's Liberation Army, uh, did in fact bring down a U.S. aircraft. It turns out a windfall of intelligence,
Mhm.
you know, benefit to the Chinese as a result. Um, when we have to take a very brief pause, Grant. When we come back, I want to talk to you a bit further about Taiwan and where things stand at the moment. The possibility of an blockade being mounted by the Chinese as part of the next ratcheting up of the threat there. That and more with Grant Newsham right after this.